Imagine stepping into a courtroom in the year 1200. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the murmurs of the assembled crowd hushed as a robed judge takes his seat. A dispute unfolds, a case of stolen property, a boundary disagreement, perhaps even an accusation of a terrible crime. Someone needs to speak, to share what they saw, what they know. But what if that someone is a woman? Would her words carry the same weight as a man's? What would it feel like to stand in such a place, to have truth on your lips, only to realize the very ground beneath your feet was designed to make your testimony crumble into dust? Number 1. The weight of feme covert and property rights. In the year 1200, across much of medieval Europe, the legal concept of feme covert cast a long, silencing shadow over married women. Imagine a world where, the moment you said, "I do," your very legal existence was largely absorbed into that of your husband. It was as if, overnight, you became a single, larger legal entity with him, and he was the speaking part. This wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a fundamental principle of common law that dictated who could own property, who could enter into contracts, and critically, who could stand as an independent witness in a court of law, especially when it involved serious financial or land matters. Think about a woman named Eleanor, living in a small village in England. For her marriage as a feme soul or single woman, Eleanor might have had certain rights, perhaps even the ability to inherit and manage property left to her by her parents. She could potentially sue or be sued in her own name, a glimmer of independent legal standing. The moment she married Richard, a local farmer, her legal identity transformed. Richard became the cover over her, encompassing her legal rights and responsibilities. This meant that any property she brought into the marriage, any land or goods, now legally belonged to Richard. She could not sell it, mortgage it, or even make significant decisions about it without his consent. And if that property was ever in dispute, if a neighbor claimed a sliver of their field or someone tried to steal their livestock, it was Richard, not Eleanor, who had the primary right and responsibility to represent the family's interests in court. So if Eleanor had witnessed the neighbor's cattle straying onto their land, or saw the local lord's bailiff unjustly seizing their grain, her direct testimony, while potentially heard, would often be filtered through the lens of her husband's legal identity. Her words were not those of an independent witness with her own stake, but rather that of a person whose legal interests were entirely subsumed by her husband's. Court saw Richard, the legal head of the household, as the one who held the primary right to speak on behalf of their joint property and rights. Her account, while valuable for gathering information, was not considered the primary or most authoritative legal statement in such matters. It was as if her voice, in legal terms, echoed from within her husband's, rather than standing alone. This concept was deeply intertwined with the economic structure of the time. Land was power, and inheritance was the cornerstone of family wealth and social status. To allow women independent control over property, especially after marriage, was seen as potentially undermining the patriarchal lineage and the stability of male-headed households. The legal system was designed to consolidate wealth and power within the male line, ensuring that land passed from father to son, or at least remained firmly under male control. A woman's inability to fully own or manage property meant her direct stake in property-related legal disputes was diminished. If she couldn't legally claim the land or the goods, her testimony about its rightful ownership held less inherent weight from a legal standpoint, even if her factual account was perfectly accurate. Consider a situation where a widow, who had been granted a dower, a portion of her deceased husband's estate for her lifetime support, found herself in a dispute over that land. While a dower gave her some control, it was often limited, and the ultimate ownership still rested with her husband's male heirs. If she needed to testify against a distant relative who was encroaching on her dower land, her legal standing was still precarious. She was a temporary holder, not an independent owner in the way a man could be. Her words carried the weight of her dependency, not the authority of ultimate ownership. This principle was not just about ownership. It permeated all aspects of a married woman's legal life. She could not generally enter into contracts without her husband's permission, nor could she be sued for debts she incurred. Any legal action taken against her or on her behalf was usually directed through her husband. This meant that her capacity to act as an independent legal agent, including serving as a primary witness, was severely curtailed. The system was designed to channel all significant legal interactions through the male head of the household. The impact of feme covert on a woman's testimony was profound and multifaceted. It wasn't simply that she was disregarded, it was that her very legal identity was diminished to the point where her direct voice in court, particularly on matters of property and finance, was deemed secondary or even non-existent without her husband's consent or presence. Her words were seen as an extension of his will and interests, rather than her own independent observation or claim. This legal invisibility meant that even if she possessed crucial information, the structure of the court often preferred to hear it, or at least formally acknowledge it, through the male authority figure to whom she was bound. This legal constraint stood as a formidable barrier, subtly but powerfully reducing the inherent value and standing of a woman's testimony in the legal proceedings of 1200. It wasn't just about what she said, but about who she was, or rather, who she was legally considered not to be. Number 2, limited education and literacy. Picture a medieval village in 1200. The vast majority of its inhabitants, men and women alike, were illiterate. The ability to read and write was a rare skill, often confined to the clergy, some wealthy merchants, and a select few scribes and administrators. For women, however, the opportunities for formal education were even more severely restricted than they were for men. While some noblewomen might learn to read, primarily for religious texts or household management, and some convent nuns certainly engaged with literacy, the average woman in the countryside or even in the towns was unlikely to receive any formal schooling. This widespread lack of literacy had significant, yet often overlooked, implications for the value of a woman's testimony in court. Consider a legal dispute in the local manorial court. Perhaps a woman named Agnes wants to report that a neighbor has been stealing her chickens. She has seen it with her own eyes, she has heard the squawking, she has counted the missing birds. She wants to present her case. The legal proceedings, even in a seemingly simple manorial court, could be surprisingly complex. Documents, charters, and written records were increasingly used, even if not universally understood. Oaths, while spoken, often referred to legal precedents or specific written rules that might be read aloud by the court clerk. A woman who could not read or write might struggle to understand the nuances of the legal language, the formal charges being laid, or the precise nature of the laws being invoked. Imagine Agnes trying to understand a written complaint filed against her, or attempting to follow along as a legal document is read aloud, filled with terms that assume familiarity with legal concepts. Inability to read or write would not only impede her comprehension, but also her ability to effectively formulate her own arguments or rebuttals. How could she verify dates or names in a document if she could not read them herself? How could she effectively consult written evidence presented by the other side? This lack of understanding, born from illiteracy, could make her appear less credible or less capable in the eyes of the court, even if her facts were sound. She might rely entirely on memory and oral tradition, while the court was increasingly valuing written proof and formal procedures. Furthermore, the legal system at the time often involved the presentation of charters, deeds, and other written instruments, especially in cases concerning land, inheritance, or significant debts. A woman who could not read these documents would be at a profound disadvantage. She would be forced to rely on the interpretations of others, often male clerks or attorneys, who might not always have her best interests at heart. If she claimed a right based on an old family charter, but could not read the charter herself to verify its contents, her claim could be easily dismissed or challenged. Her lack of literacy made her dependent, and dependence often translated into a perceived lack of authority or independent judgment in a court setting. Let's think about a situation where a woman, say Matilda, claims a debt is owed to her from a merchant. The merchant produces a written receipt or a ledger entry. Matilda cannot read it to verify if it is indeed her signature, or if the amount is correct, or if the debt has truly been paid. Her only recourse is to state what she remembers or believes to be true. But in a system increasingly reliant on verifiable written records, her memory, however accurate, might be deemed less reliable than a physical written document that she could not refute or even interpret. This created an inherent power imbalance, where those who controlled literacy controlled the narrative in court. Beyond comprehension and validation of documents, literacy also played a role in the ability to prepare a case. While formal legal representation, as we know it, was rudimentary, individuals still had to organize their thoughts, present their evidence, and articulate their position clearly. A man who could read and write might draft a simple petition, consult written laws, if available, or at least have a clearer mental framework for organizing his arguments by jotting down notes. A woman who could not do any of this would be forced to rely solely on her memory and her oral presentation skills, which might be less persuasive in a formal, often intimidating, court setting where formality and structured argumentation were valued. It wasn't just about reading words, it was about the cognitive processes that literacy fostered. It allowed for structured thought, the analysis of complex information, and the systematic organization of evidence. A woman who had been denied the opportunity to develop these skills through education might struggle to navigate the intricate verbal duels and procedural demands of the court. Testimony, even if truthful, might come across as less coherent, less informed, or simply less authoritative because she lacked the intellectual tools that literacy provided. The medieval court system, even in its nascent stages, was already leaning towards a world where the written word held increasing sway, and those excluded from its mysteries were inherently disadvantaged. This lack of educational access thus contributed significantly to the subtle erosion of a woman's testimony, not because she was inherently less intelligent, but because she was systematically denied the very tools that would allow her words to resonate with authority and clarity in the legal arena. Number 3. Societal expectations of modesty and silence. In the year 1200, the ideal woman, according to prevailing societal norms and religious teachings, was characterized by virtues such as piety, chastity, and above all, modesty and silence. These were not just suggestions, they were deeply ingrained expectations, often reinforced by religious sermons, popular literature, and community pressure. A woman who spoke too loudly, too often, or too assertively, especially in public forums, risked being labeled as immodest, unruly, or even morally questionable. This deeply held social expectation had a direct, often detrimental, impact on how a woman's testimony was perceived and valued in a medieval courtroom. Imagine a woman, perhaps named Isolde, who has been grievously wronged. Perhaps her husband has been murdered, and she witnessed the act, or she has been the victim of a theft or assault. She wants to speak to demand justice. But as she steps into the courtroom, she is not just facing the judge and the accused, she is facing the entire weight of societal expectation. Her natural instinct might be to express her anguish, to recount the events with passion and detail. However, this very expression could work against her. A virtuous woman was expected to be demure, to keep her voice low, to avoid drawing undue attention to herself. Public speaking, especially in a contentious setting like a court, was largely considered a male domain. A woman who spoke out forcefully might be seen as transgressing these gendered boundaries, thereby undermining her own credibility. Consider the optics. If Isolde speaks with too much emotion, too much passion, she might be seen as irrational or hysterical, fitting into the stereotype of women being easily swayed by their feelings. If she speaks too calmly, too matter-of-factly, she might be seen as cold or unfeeling, perhaps even complicit, especially if the crime was a personal one. There was a narrow, almost impossible, path for a woman to navigate to appear both truthful and appropriately modest in a court setting. The very act of speaking in a public forum, especially one as formal and male-dominated as a court, was itself a challenge to the ideal of female silence. This expectation of silence was not just about demeanor, it could also influence the content and extent of a woman's testimony. A modest woman might be hesitant to recount explicit details of a crime, especially if it involved sensitive matters like sexual assault or personal injury, out of a desire to protect her own reputation and dignity. In a society where a woman's honor was intrinsically tied to her chastity and good reputation, any public discussion of such topics, even if she was the victim, could bring shame upon her and her family. This fear of social condemnation might lead her to downplay certain aspects of her testimony, or even to avoid coming forward altogether, thereby weakening her case or preventing justice from being served. Let's look at it from the perspective of the judge or the male jurors. They were products of the same society, steeped in the same expectations. When a woman spoke, they were not just listening to her words, they were also subconsciously evaluating her against the prevailing norms of female behavior. A woman who appeared too outspoken, too forward, or who seemed to enjoy the attention of the court, might be silently judged as less trustworthy, her testimony viewed with skepticism, not because of its content, but because of her perceived breach of gender propriety. A truly modest woman, it was believed, would be reluctant to put herself in such a public position. Therefore, the very act of a woman testifying with confidence might ironically detract from her perceived veracity in the eyes of the court. There were also specific legal contexts where a woman's testimony was outright prohibited or severely limited due to these social expectations. For instance, in certain ecclesiastical courts dealing with moral offenses, or in cases requiring multiple witnesses, the testimony of women might be outright excluded or counted as half that of a man, partly on the grounds that their modesty would prevent them from speaking freely or truthfully about certain, unseemly matters. The underlying assumption was that a truly modest woman would not want to engage in the public and often crude discourse of the courtroom, and if she did, her motives might be questionable. The ideal of female silence and modesty was a powerful social constraint that translated directly into legal disadvantage. It created a climate where a woman's ability to speak her truth in court was not just a matter of factual accuracy, but also a precarious tightrope walk between presenting her case and maintaining her societal standing. Her words, no matter how true, were perpetually weighed against the invisible but heavy scales of prevailing gender norms, often finding them wanting not for lack of truth, but for daring to break the silence expected of them. This unspoken expectation served as a powerful, systemic barrier, silently reducing the weight of a woman's testimony in the medieval courtroom. Number 4. Exclusion from public and professional spheres. In 1200, the world was largely divided into public and private spheres. Public sphere, the marketplaces, the guilds, the governing councils, and especially the courts, was overwhelmingly the domain of men. Women, by contrast, were primarily confined to the private sphere, the home, the hearth, and the domestic responsibilities of managing the household, raising children, and engaging in household production like spinning or baking. This profound separation meant that most women lacked any significant experience or familiarity with the workings of public life, including the intricate procedures and expectations of a legal setting. This exclusion, in turn, subtly but powerfully diminished the perceived value and reliability of their testimony in court. Imagine a man, perhaps a merchant or a craftsman, who regularly participates in the public life of his town. He deals with contracts, discusses prices, negotiates agreements, and perhaps even sits on a local council or serves as a juror. He is accustomed to public discourse, to presenting arguments, to understanding formal procedures, and to navigating the complexities of commercial and legal interactions. When such a man enters a courtroom to testify, he brings with him a lifetime of experience in public engagement, a familiarity with formal language, and an understanding of how to articulate his thoughts in a structured and persuasive manner. Now consider a woman, perhaps a farmer's wife named Marjorie. Her life is centered around the rhythm of the seasons, the care of her family, the daily chores of the farm. Her interactions are primarily within her family and perhaps a close circle of female neighbors. She might never have had cause to speak in front of a large group, to engage in formal debate, or to understand the specific protocols of a court. When Marjorie is called to testify, even if she is speaking absolute truth, she is operating in an alien environment. She might be nervous, her voice might tremble, she might struggle to articulate her thoughts clearly under pressure. She might not understand the specific legal questions being asked, or the implications of her answers in a formal legal context. This lack of familiarity with the public sphere was not merely about nervousness. It was about a fundamental disconnect with the very language and conventions of the court. Legal proceedings, even in the 13th century, had their own jargon, their own rituals, their own ways of eliciting testimony. A man who was accustomed to public life might intuitively understand these conventions, while a woman might find them baffling. This could lead to misunderstandings, hesitation, or answers that, while truthful, did not fit the precise legal framework the court expected, making her appear less certain or less credible. Furthermore, the types of knowledge and experience valued in court often stemmed from public activities. Business dealings, property transactions, public disputes, or even knowledge of local customs and laws were typically acquired through participation in the public sphere. If a woman's life was circumscribed by the domestic, she might simply not possess the kind of knowledge or experience that was considered relevant or authoritative in legal matters. For example, a man might testify about a market dispute because he was a regular at the market, aware of its customs and prices. A woman, largely absent from such public marketplaces except perhaps to sell a few eggs, would lack that direct, public experience that gave weight to a man's word in such a context. The exclusion extended to formal professional roles. Women were generally barred from becoming lawyers, judges, scribes, or any of the official roles within the legal system. This meant that the entire legal apparatus was run by men, shaped by male perspectives, and geared towards male ways of understanding and presenting evidence. There were no female judges to empathize with a woman's discomfort in a public setting, no female lawyers to skillfully extract her testimony in a way that resonated with the court, and no female scribes to record her words without unconscious bias. The entire system was inherently masculine, and women were outsiders looking in, or rather, being looked at and judged by it. Consider a case of a boundary dispute over land. A man might have walked the boundaries, engaged in discussions with neighbors, and seen various charters and agreements relating to the land. A woman, even if she lived on the land her entire life, might only know its boundaries from her husband's descriptions or from her observations of her children playing near its edge. Her knowledge, though practical, might be deemed less authoritative than a man's knowledge, which was steeped in public understanding, formal agreements, and communal recognition of land divisions. The cumulative effect of this exclusion was that women were often perceived as lacking the necessary intellectual rigor, practical experience, or public credibility to be truly reliable witnesses. Their lives, lived away from the formal structures of society, meant they were seen as less knowledgeable about the affairs of the world, and thus less capable of offering informed and reliable testimony within the specific context of a legal proceeding. It was not just about their capacity to speak the truth, but about their perceived capacity to speak it in a way that the male-dominated court system understood and valued, a capacity systematically denied to them by their forced confinement to the domestic sphere. Number 5, perceived emotional nature. One of the most persistent and damaging stereotypes about women in the year 1200, deeply rooted in medieval philosophy, medicine, and theology, was the belief that they were inherently more emotional, less rational, and more susceptible to their passions than men. This was not just a casual observation. It was often presented as a physiological and spiritual truth, based on the prevalent understanding of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the idea that women were naturally cooler and wetter, making them prone to instability and an excessive emotion. This pervasive belief fundamentally undermined the credibility of a woman's testimony in court. Imagine a woman, perhaps named Julian, comes to court to report a crime. Her home has been robbed and she is distraught. Her voice might tremble, her eyes might well up with tears, she might speak with a certain tremor of anger or fear. To a modern observer, these would be natural and understandable reactions to trauma. But in the medieval courtroom, these very displays of emotion could be interpreted as signs of her inherent weakness and irrationality. Her emotional distress, instead of eliciting sympathy or bolstering her plea, might actually be seen as evidence that her testimony was unreliable, swayed by her feelings rather than rooted in clear, objective fact. Consider the prevailing medical theories of the time. Women were often thought to be governed by their wombs, which were believed to wander and cause various ailments, including emotional instability. The concept of hysteria, from the Greek word for womb, hystera, was already beginning to take shape, linking female emotional outbursts to their biological nature. A woman's tears, her passionate plea, her anger, or even her calm demeanor, if it was seen as unnatural for a woman in distress, could be dismissed as manifestations of her emotional, rather than rational, state. Judge or jurors steeped in these beliefs might conclude that her testimony, however fervent, was simply a product of her easily agitated female nature, rendering it less trustworthy than the calm, reasoned account of a man. This prejudice also played out in a subtle but pervasive way. A man's testimony was often seen as inherently objective, grounded in reason and logic. He was perceived as capable of separating his feelings from the facts. A woman, by contrast, was believed to be incapable of this separation. Her truth, it was thought, was always colored by her emotions. Therefore, even if she was speaking what she believed to be true, the court might suspect that her perceptions were distorted by fear, anger, love, or even feminine guile. This meant that her testimony had to be scrutinized much more rigorously, often discounted if any trace of emotion was detectable, whereas a man's emotional display might be seen as righteous indignation or a sign of his deep commitment to justice. Let's illustrate with an example. Suppose a man, Peter, and a woman, Sarah, both witness the same street brawl. Peter recounts the events in a stoic, factual manner. Sarah, visibly distressed by the violence, describes the scene with trembling hands and a recounting of her fear during the event. While both accounts might be factually identical, the medieval court might lend more weight to Peter's testimony. His lack of overt emotion would be seen as a sign of his rationality and objectivity, while Sarah's emotional display would confirm the prevailing stereotype of women as unreliable due to their passionate nature. Truth, though real to her, was deemed less valuable because of the way she expressed it, or rather, the way her expression was interpreted through the lens of misogynistic medical and philosophical beliefs. Furthermore, this belief in female emotionality was also used to imply that women were more easily deceived or more prone to malicious gossip and slander. If a woman's judgment was inherently clouded by her feelings, then she might be easily misled by others, or she might maliciously invent accusations out of spite, jealousy, or romantic infatuation. This underlying suspicion meant that a woman's character was often subject to intense scrutiny in court, far more so than a man's, simply because her perceived emotional vulnerability made her word inherently suspect. The perceived emotional nature of women was not just a minor factor. It was a deeply ingrained cultural assumption that cast a long shadow over every woman who dared to speak in court in 1200. It created an environment where her very being, her natural human responses, could be used as an argument against the validity of her words. Truth was always vulnerable to being dismissed as mere female hysteria or the product of an overactive imagination, rather than the reasoned observation of an objective witness. This pervasive prejudice was a silent yet formidable barrier that systematically devalued a woman's testimony, making her words inherently less weighty than a man's, not for their content, but for their source. Number 6. Legal status as dependents. In the year 1200, the legal systems of most European societies were built upon a hierarchical structure where adult men, particularly landowners, held primary legal standing. Women, by contrast, were largely defined by their relationship to a male guardian. Whether as a daughter, a wife, or a widow, a woman's legal identity was often subsumed under that of her father, husband, or even her adult brother or a male relative. This status as a legal dependent meant that a woman often lacked the independent legal personhood necessary to act as a fully autonomous agent in the eyes of the law, a crucial factor that severely diminished the weight of her testimony in court. Imagine a young woman named Alara, whose father, a respected craftsman, has passed away. Before her marriage, she is considered to be under the tutelage or guardianship of her nearest male relative, perhaps an uncle or an older brother. This guardian would manage any property she might inherit, represent her interests in legal matters, and even arrange her marriage. If Alara witnessed a theft from her family's workshop, and she wanted to testify, her statement would often need to be presented through her male guardian. It was his voice, his legal presence, that held the formal weight in court, not hers. Her words, while perhaps heard, were considered ancillary to his formal representation of her interests. She was a witness, yes, but not a primary legal actor in her own right. This dependency was formalized in various aspects of law. For instance, a woman could not typically initiate a lawsuit on her own behalf, especially concerning property or serious criminal matters, without the consent or active participation of her guardian. If she had a grievance, it was her guardian who would bring the action, and who would be held legally responsible for its outcome. This meant that the formal presentation of evidence, including testimony, would ideally come from the guardian, who was deemed the responsible legal entity. Her voice was secondary, not independent. Consider a case of a married woman, let's call her Beatrice. As we discussed earlier with feme covert, her legal identity was largely absorbed by her husband's. Beatrice witnessed a crime against her household, such as a neighbor trespassing and damaging their fence. It would be her husband, not Beatrice, who was expected to bring the complaint to the manorial court. And it would be his testimony that carried the primary legal weight regarding the damage to his property. Beatrice's account might be corroborating, but it was not the fundamental legal statement of grievance from an independent party. Court saw the grievance as belonging to the male head of the household, the one legally responsible for the family's assets and welfare. Even for widows who gained some degree of legal autonomy after their husband's death, their independence was often limited. While a widow might manage her dower land and initiate some legal actions, her standing was still often considered less robust than that of an unmarried man. She was often seen as a temporary head of household, potentially subject to the influence of her adult sons or male relatives, particularly if significant property was involved. Testimony, even when independent, might still be scrutinized more closely than a man's, partly because of her historical status as a dependent and the ingrained societal perception that women required male oversight. This legal dependency stemmed from a broader societal understanding that women, due to their perceived physical and emotional weakness, required protection and guidance from men. While this was framed as a benevolent responsibility, its practical effect was to strip women of their independent legal agency. If you are legally considered to be under the wing of another, you cannot truly stand alone in a formal setting that demands individual responsibility and autonomy. Your words, therefore, carry the implied caveat that they are spoken by someone who is not fully responsible for their own legal actions or consequences. The implications for a woman's testimony were profound. It meant that her word, however true, often lacked the inherent legal authority of an independent party. She was not seen as a fully self-governing individual capable of entering the legal arena on her own terms, bearing the full weight of responsibility for her statements. Instead, her testimony was filtered through, or supported by, the male legal authority to whom she was attached. This systematic legal marginalization, grounded in the concept of female dependency, fundamentally weakened the standing and inherent value of a woman's testimony in the medieval court, making it a supportive piece of evidence rather than a foundational one. Her voice, while potentially heard, was rarely the primary legal voice in the room. Number 7. Religious interpretations and scriptural bias. The year 1200 was a time when the church held immense power and influence over every aspect of life, including law and morality. Christian theology, interpreted through the prevailing lens of patriarchal society, heavily influenced the perception of women. Biblical narratives and the writings of early church fathers were often used to reinforce the idea of female subordination and, crucially, to cast doubt on women's inherent reliability, particularly in public or authoritative roles. This deeply ingrained religious interpretation contributed significantly to the lower value placed on a woman's testimony in medieval courts. At the heart of this bias lay the story of Eve in the book of Genesis. Eve was depicted as the first to succumb to temptation, leading humanity into sin. This narrative was widely interpreted to mean that women were inherently weaker in character, more easily deceived by evil, and more prone to moral transgression than men. The Apostle Paul's writings, particularly passages that stated women should learn in quietness and full submission and not have authority over men, were also hugely influential. These scriptural interpretations formed a powerful theological foundation for the belief that women were not fit to hold positions of authority, to lead, or to speak authoritatively in public forums, including the solemn setting of a courtroom. Imagine a woman, let's call her Martha, testifying in a trial. Perhaps she's accusing a man of theft or assault. The very act of a woman speaking authoritatively in a public forum, especially accusing a man, could be seen as a transgression against divinely ordained order. Judge and jurors, likely devout Christians, would have been deeply influenced by these religious teachings. When Martha spoke, her words would not only be weighed on their factual merit, but also subtly, and often unconsciously, against the backdrop of Eve's fall and Paul's injunctions. Was she, like Eve, easily led astray? Was her accusation perhaps driven by feminine weakness or malice, rather than objective truth? This religious skepticism about women's reliability extended to their oath. In medieval legal systems, the swearing of an oath before God was a cornerstone of testimony. It was believed that a false oath would incur divine wrath. However, if women were seen as inherently more susceptible to temptation and sin, then their oaths might be considered less binding, less truthful, or more easily broken than those of men. Some legal traditions, particularly in certain ecclesiastical courts, explicitly stipulated that the testimony of women was less weighty than that of men, sometimes requiring two women's testimonies to equal one man's, or even outright excluding women from testifying in certain cases, particularly those involving moral offenses where a woman's perceived moral weakness could lead to false accusation. Consider a case involving a dispute over a marriage contract or a matter of inheritance. If a woman, perhaps a relative, claimed to have witnessed a crucial promise, her word might be met with skepticism. Prevailing religious view might suggest that women were more easily swayed by personal feelings, such as affection or resentment, making their recollections less reliable in formal legal agreements. Testimony might be viewed as less solid, less impervious to human error or manipulation than that of a male witness, whose rational and spiritual fortitude was presumed to be greater. Furthermore, the Church also promoted the ideal of monastic life and celibacy as the highest form of spiritual devotion, often contrasting it with the perceived worldly distractions and temptations associated with marriage and earthly life. While not directly about legal testimony, this broader cultural emphasis on women as sources of temptation or distractions from spiritual pursuits could subtly reinforce the idea that their voices and perspectives were inherently less pure or objective, when contrasted with those of celibate male clergy or other male authorities who were seen as closer to divine wisdom. The theological foundation for women's subordination was pervasive and deeply woven into the intellectual and moral fabric of medieval society. It was not just a societal norm, it was perceived as a divine truth. Therefore, when a woman stood in court to testify in 1200, she was not just contending with legal procedures and human biases, but with centuries of religious doctrine that implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, questioned her very capacity for objective truth and reliable judgment. This powerful religious current flowed beneath the surface of every legal proceeding, consistently diminishing the inherent value and trustworthiness of a woman's spoken word in the eyes of the court. Number 8. Physical vulnerability and trial by ordeal or combat. In the legal landscape of 1200, methods of proof often went beyond mere spoken testimony. Justice was not always about reasoned arguments and presented evidence in the way we understand it today. Instead, it frequently relied on physically demanding or supernatural forms of proof, such as trial by ordeal or trial by combat. These methods, deeply embedded in the medieval legal system, inherently disadvantaged women, subtly but powerfully diminishing the weight and standing of their testimony. Consider trial by ordeal, a common method for determining guilt or innocence, especially in serious criminal cases where direct evidence was lacking. This could involve ordeals of hot iron, hot water, or cold water. In the ordeal of hot iron, the accused would carry a red-hot iron for a set distance, and then their hand would be bandaged. After 3 days, if the wound was healing cleanly, they were deemed innocent; if infected, guilty. In the ordeal of cold water, the accused, tied up, was thrown into consecrated water. If they sank, they were innocent, as the pure water received them. If they floated, they were guilty, as the water rejected them. For women, participating in such ordeals was fraught with peril. Their physical constitution was generally considered weaker than men's. The intense physical and mental strain of these ordeals would be far more taxing. While both men and women suffered under these brutal tests, the prevailing belief in female frailty meant that a woman's failure in an ordeal might be attributed to her inherent weakness rather than her guilt, creating a confusing and unjust outcome. Moreover, the very act of subjecting a woman to such a public and physically invasive test might have been seen as unseemly or undignified, further complicating her position in court, even if she was merely a witness. The system itself, by relying on such physical proofs, inherently marginalized those who were seen as physically weaker. Even more explicitly disadvantaging for women was trial by combat, also known as judicial duel. This was a method of proof where two parties in a dispute, or their champions, would fight a duel, with the victor presumed to be in the right, as God supposedly granted victory to the just party. This was particularly common in disputes over land ownership, debt, or accusations of serious crime. For women, direct participation in trial by combat was generally out of the question. A woman was rarely, if ever, expected to fight in a judicial duel herself. Instead, she would have to rely on a male champion to fight on her behalf. Imagine a woman, perhaps a widow named Agnes, accused of a serious crime, or involved in a land dispute against a powerful neighbor. The case went to trial by combat, Agnes could not take up arms herself. She would need to find a champion, a male relative, a hired mercenary, or a loyal retainer to fight on her behalf. This immediately placed her at a disadvantage. Fate was now literally in someone else's hands, dependent on the strength, skill, and loyalty of another person. Her direct testimony, her detailed account of the events, her earnest plea for justice, all would be rendered secondary to the brute force of a duel fought by men. Champions were not just fighters. They were also seen as representing the litigant's cause, and the outcome of the fight was considered divine judgment on the truth of the case. Agnes's champion lost. It was not merely a defeat for him. It was a divine pronouncement against her innocence or the validity of her claim. Personal testimony, no matter how compelling or truthful it may have been, was entirely superseded by the physical outcome of a fight in which she could not participate. This system inherently diminished the value of her verbal testimony, prioritizing physical prowess and divine intervention over spoken evidence. Furthermore, the very threat of such physical trials could deter women from bringing complaints or testifying in the first place. Who would want to risk their life, or the life of a loved one, in a duel, especially when her own physical weakness meant she could not defend herself? This could lead to a chilling effect, where women might choose to suffer injustice in silence rather than risk the violent and unpredictable nature of medieval legal processes. The reliance on physical proofs like ordeals and combat underscored a fundamental aspect of medieval justice. It was often a test of physical endurance and strength, or a direct appeal to divine intervention through physical means, rather than a purely intellectual or evidentiary process. In such a system, where physical capacity and martial prowess held significant sway, the inherent physical vulnerability of women and their inability to directly engage in these forms of proof profoundly undermined the credibility and practical weight of their testimony. Their words simply could not compete with the clang of swords or the searing pain of a hot iron, leaving them in a weaker, less credible position within the male-dominated legal framework of 1200.